Hey everyone, welcome back to Dark Ascent. Today, I've compiled some of the worst and most brutal mountain deaths ever recorded. From an egoistic climber who worshipped Reinhold Messner, the most famous mountaineer alive, and tried to climb exactly the way he did, to an arrogant couple who made fun of a Sherpa, not knowing the kind of brutal karma the mountain was about to hand them. It was August 2nd, 2015 on K2. Rising in the central Karakoram system, near the frontier between Pakistan and China, an environment shaped by towering ice seracs, narrow ascent corridors, and long exposed ridgelines above 26,000 feet. Nicole Ambon was 27 years old and worked as a wedding planner in Denver, Colorado. Known for structure and precision in her professional life, she approached the expedition with the same planning mindset, where outcomes were expected to follow preparation. K2, however, operated outside that logic, where environmental limits override scheduling and control. In the months before the climb, she set a personal goal tied to reaching the summit before turning 30, framing the ascent as a symbolic transition point. The idea of a summit photograph became part of that milestone narrative, adding personal meaning to the objective beyond the climb itself. She had limited high-altitude experience above 20,000 feet, enough to understand early acclimatization effects, but not the sustained decline typical above 8,000 meters. She joined a lower-cost guiding operation on the Abruzzi Spur, where logistical margins were thinner and timing flexibility more constrained than on larger commercial expeditions. A small public fundraising effort also tied external attention to her success, reinforcing the sense of a defined outcome. Acclimatization progressed unevenly. She required slower rotations and additional recovery time, and by Camp the 30 showed swelling in extremities and persistent fatigue beyond expected levels. Guides noted the symptoms but continued the schedule due to a narrowing weather window and the need to commit to a summit attempt while conditions briefly stabilized. Before the summit push, she carried a lightweight white dress and camera equipment intended for summit documentation. To accommodate this, she reduced backup provisions and redundancy in her load, slightly narrowing her physiological and safety buffer in an environment where margins are already minimal. It always looks like a small trade-off when you're packing. Nobody really feels the consequence of it yet at that point. The summit rotation began under deteriorating conditions. Above 26,000 feet, her movement slowed, and fixed-line progress required frequent pauses and assistance. Despite this, she continued upward and reached the summit late in the operating window, entering descent as weather and visibility began to decline. Instead of turning back right away, she stopped for a short moment near the summit to take it in and get a quick shot tied to the goal she'd been aiming for. That delay pushed her onto a later descent schedule, putting her into the afternoon hours when the snow higher up tends to get less stable. Descent toward the bottleneck occurred as conditions shifted into warmer afternoon instability. The traverse below the hanging glacier funnels climbers into a narrow corridor beneath exposed serac walls, where even small timing delays increase exposure to overhead hazard. As she moved below the summit zone, her descent became slower and more intermittent, with longer pauses on steep sections, before resuming with assistance from fixed lines. Fatigue and altitude-related impairment became more visible, and spacing between her and the main group gradually widened during transitions between anchors, reducing collective movement control in the corridor. It's like everything just gets erased in one stretch of movement. While multiple teams were descending through the same constrained passage, a section of overhead ice and accumulated snow released from above the traverse. The collapse expanded quickly into an avalanche flow that crossed the fixed ropes, striking climbers on the route and overwhelming the narrow channel beneath the bottleneck. Nicole was swept from the slope and carried downslope within the moving snow and debris field, disappearing from view below the traverse as the flow continued across uneven terrain. Immediate rescue was not possible due to continuing instability in the release zone, reduced visibility, and the risk of secondary slides in the same corridor. Search operations were delayed until conditions stabilized several days later. Her body was recovered below the traverse in a deposition zone consistent with avalanche transport and burial under mixed snow and ice debris. The expedition review identified contributing factors including late descent timing into an afternoon instability window, accumulated fatigue from extended summit rotations, congestion along the fixed line corridor, and the environmental transition zone beneath Serac structures. The final assessment pointed to timing on the descent. A short stop during a summit moment pushed her into unstable afternoon conditions, where she was caught in fast-moving snow and ice rather than a single mistake. It was October 12th, 2019. Autumn trekking season was in full swing across the Khumbu region, and a stretch of unusually stable weather had made the mountains feel more predictable than they really were. The 4 boys who showed up at the trail entrance that morning were from Namche Bazar, a small mountain town in Nepal up in the Khumbu region, sitting around 11,300 feet above sea level. For them, the mountains weren't anything unusual. They grew up with them right there in front of them every day. Visible from school, from the streets, from basically everywhere. Big peaks like Tamsurku and Kongdari were just part of the background of their lives. So over time, it all started to feel normal. Not something they thought about much, just something that was always there. And that kind of familiarity made the whole landscape feel less like something intimidating and more like something they already understood, even if they really didn't. Clyde Mortensen was 16 years old and a student at a local school. Teachers and family described him as capable and self-directed, someone who enjoyed fixing things and teaching himself mechanical skills through online videos. He navigated the steep local paths with ease, had some trekking experience with his family, and had developed a growing confidence in high-altitude movement. Within the group, he was generally regarded as the most experienced outdoorsman. His father worked in Kathmandu during the week, and his mother believed he was spending the weekend at a friend's house in the village. Preston Balin, also 16 years old, had been Clyde's closest friend since childhood. He was the largest of the 4 boys, standing just over 6 feet tall. His parents were away in the lower valleys for the weekend and expected only a routine check-in message, which he had already sent before the hiking plans were finalized. Setal Pangsha was the quietest member of the group, more observant than outspoken. He had recently developed an interest in photography after receiving a DSLR camera from a relative. His main reason for joining the trip was to photograph the autumn colors of the birch and rhododendron forests near Tengbosch, something he had been planning to do for weeks leading up to October 14th, 2019. His mother, working shifts at a regional clinic, believed he was staying at Clyde's house. Geyser Alcott was the least physically prepared for a long mountain hike. He had a lighter build and mild asthma, managed with an inhaler he did not always carry consistently. His parents maintained stricter rules regarding unsupervised outdoor activities, so he told them he would be spending the weekend at Preston's house. They expected him home for Sunday dinner. The ability for the group to make the trip without immediate parental intervention was not the result of travel distance or concealment, but rather the informality of supervision within a closely connected mountain community where short local hikes were common and often unrecorded. All 4 boys lived within walking distance of each other in the Namche Bazar area, where short overnight plans into nearby valleys or ridge trails were a routine part of local youth activity during stable weather windows. In this environment, permission was often implied rather than formally requested, particularly for outings perceived as familiar terrain rather than structured expeditions. I think what gets me here is how normal it probably felt to them. It's not like they were sneaking off in some dramatic way. It's more like, in a place like that, you don't really sit down and formally run a hike past anyone. It's just going out for a bit and that's it. Each household operated under different levels of oversight, and communication between families relied heavily on assumptions rather than direct coordination. One boy's parents believed he was staying with another household, while others relied on expected check-in patterns that were typical for short weekend absences. Because the plan was framed internally as a brief local hike with a return before Sunday obligations, it did not trigger immediate concern or verification. No formal trekking agency, guide service, or lodge registration was involved in their departure, and there was no centralized system in place that cross-checked short local movements by residents within the valley. As a result, their absence initially blended into normal patterns of youth activity in the region. Until the expected return, times passed without contact. Clyde's mom was handling the week on her own and trusted that he could look after himself. Preston's parents were out of town and just relied on the usual check-in messages. Settle's mom was working shifts and didn't really have a way to double-check anything. Geyser's parents were probably the most strict out of the four, but even then, it was only supposed to be a short overnight trip, something that, if they had actually been asked, might have seemed normal enough to allow. But no one asked. It was just planned quietly over text on Thursday night, then pretty much locked in by Friday. And what really sticks with me is this. There weren't really any parents actively in that loop at the moment. It mattered. Not checking, not confirming, not actually there in the decision. Beyond Tengboshe, several lesser-used footpaths climb toward open ridgelines above the monastery. These routes are occasionally used by local hikers, herders, and trekking staff seeking higher viewpoints above the forested slopes. The trail continues beyond Tengbosch toward the upper Khumbu Valley, following established trekking routes that climb gradually toward high alpine viewpoints above the tree line. Local hikers sometimes refer to an informal ridge overlook above the upper valley, reached through a steep gain of roughly 3,000 to 3,500 feet, depending on the chosen approach. The lower section is forested and relatively well shaded, with a worn, established path from regular use. Between roughly miles 3 and 5, the terrain transitions as trees thin, wind exposure increases, and the landscape opens toward the upper Khumbu Valley. Above about 14,500 feet, the trail just opens up completely. No trees, no windbreaks, just open alpine ground. The vegetation gets really thin, and in some parts it turns into loose rock and scree, so every step actually matters a bit more. Navigation up there mostly comes down to stone cairns and painted markers along the way, because there aren't many natural landmarks once visibility drops, and the whole upper valley is basically this wide, exposed bowl surrounded by massive 8,000-meter peaks, fully open, and the weather can shift pretty fast once you're up there. I always find it a bit striking how quickly it goes from easy trail through forest to completely exposed ground. It doesn't feel gradual when you actually think about what you're walking into. In the days leading up to the hike, a high-pressure system brought unusually stable conditions for mid-October, with clear skies, light winds, and mild temperatures at village level. The group planned the hike within this window, which appeared consistent and stable on the surface. Weather forecasts distributed through trekking agencies and local lodges had indicated the possibility of deteriorating conditions over the weekend, though the timing remained uncertain. It mentioned the chance of snowfall above about 5,000 meters, along with stronger winds on the exposed ridgelines. But the thing is, even though it was publicly available, it wasn't really passed along at the trailhead, and there weren't any closure signs up yet, or any staffed warnings in place when they set out. The group reached the Tengbosch Trail entrance shortly before 8 that morning. The trail was active but not crowded. Several trekking groups had already passed through earlier that morning, while others could occasionally be seen farther ahead along the route toward Tengboshi. The boys gathered their gear, paused briefly at the stone marker, and took a photograph together under clear skies and cool autumn conditions. The temperature was approximately 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Several permit checkpoints existed along the main trekking corridor, though local residents moving between villages often passed through that with less formality than visiting trekkers. The lower section of the trail wound through dense birch and rhododendron forest, with occasional meadows and dry seasonal drainage. The path was clear and easy to follow. Clyde set a steady pace while Settle stopped periodically to photograph the golden leaves. The others waited without complaint. The atmosphere remained relaxed, and they encountered no other trekkers as they climbed. By the time they reached roughly 14,000 feet, the effects of elevation and exposure had become noticeable. Temperatures had dropped into the mid-30s, though wind remained light. Geyser used his inhaler once after experiencing mild discomfort from the cold, dry air and sustained climb. The symptoms eased quickly, and the group continued. At one point, Clyde remarked that they were getting close to the section of trail he had been describing during the planning stages. He was referring to a ridge viewpoint above Tengboche that he had seen in photographs and heard about from local hikers. His estimate of the remaining distance was optimistic, but none of the boys had previously reached that part of the trail, above 14,500 feet. The mountain changed abruptly. The trees disappeared, replaced by open alpine scrub and steady northwest winds. Temperatures were around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill reducing effective conditions to roughly 18 degrees. The boys were dressed for a cool autumn trek, but not for prolonged exposure at that elevation. The views were expansive. Golden forests stretched below the tree line, while the peaks of Everest and Lhotse stood out sharply in the clear air. Sadel photographed constantly, including a growing bank of clouds on the western horizon. Though it was the leading edge of an approaching weather system, it appeared distant and harmless from where they stood. This is the part that always feels deceptive to me, because everything still looks beautiful, everything still feels manageable, but you're already standing in conditions that are very different from what it looks like on the surface. Both Preston and Geyser commented on the cold after leaving the shelter of the forest, but neither suggested turning back. The group had already invested several hours into the climb, and the upper overlook felt close enough to justify continuing. Around midday, after more than 4 hours on the trail, they reached the upper overlook at approximately 15,600 feet. They were fully above treeline in exposed alpine terrain with no natural shelter. Winds had strengthened to an estimated 25 to 30 miles per hour. Temperatures had fallen to around 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chill placed effective conditions near 8 degrees. The boys spent roughly 20 minutes at the overlook. Settle continued photographing until the cold drained his camera battery. Geyser was visibly shivering. Preston's fingers had gone numb, and Clyde found that his phone had no service. Eventually, the decision to leave required little discussion. They had reached their destination and seen what they came to see. The cloud bank to the west was noticed, but not treated as a concern. Expecting a routine return along the same trail, the four boys turned around and began their descent. Shortly after midday, snow began moving into the upper valley. The system had been forecast to arrive later in the afternoon, but it ended up reaching the area earlier than expected. In hindsight, that kind of shift isn't unusual for fast-moving storm systems crossing the Himalayas in October. The terrain can really mess with how fronts move and speed up their timing. The official forecast had already allowed for that uncertainty by giving a range instead of a fixed arrival time. But the key thing is the boys didn't have access to any of that information while they were out. Snowfall began lightly, with wind-driven flakes most visible against dark rock rather than accumulating on impact. Within minutes, it intensified, and roughly 20 minutes later, it had become heavy horizontal snow that reduced visibility on the upper slopes to under 100 feet. The group was already on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line when visibility collapsed. Trail markers in this section consisted of stone cairns placed at regular intervals. In clear conditions, they served as the primary navigation reference, but in blowing snow and low contrast, they became difficult to locate. As conditions worsened, and early accumulation filled shallow gaps in the rock, the boys continued descending based on terrain memory and general direction, rather than confirmed visual markers. Once visibility dropped, they ended up drifting a bit off the main trail, maybe around 200 feet to the east. The problem was the slope there was just more exposed and steeper than the normal route, which is actually designed to be a more gradual, safer descent. And in that kind of low visibility, plus fatigue and altitude starting to kick in, it wasn't something they really noticed at the time. I know how quickly low visibility and keep moving turns into you've already left the safe line and you don't know it yet. As the afternoon went on, the wind picked up too, somewhere around 35 to 40 miles per hour. Snow started building up unevenly across the rocky slope, covering some surfaces while leaving others exposed. That made footing a lot worse. The snow filled in gaps between the rocks, so every step became less stable, and that just slowed them down even more and kept them out in the cold longer. Around this stage, Geyser's condition worsened significantly. He showed severe, uncontrolled shivering and reduced coordination, consistent with progressive cold stress. His breathing was strained by both exertion and thin, cold air, partially relieved but not fully controlled by his inhaler. The group slowed further to stay together, increasing time spent in worsening conditions at high elevation. Sometime later, the decision was made to stop. They took shelter behind a large boulder on the slope, one of several scattered across the rocky hillside. It provided partial wind protection, though wind continued to wrap around its edges. Visibility had dropped into near whiteout conditions, removing most terrain reference beyond a short distance. The boulder became a temporary anchor point in otherwise featureless terrain. Clyde attempted an emergency call from his phone, but there was no signal. He then composed a text message to his mother and another to a local contact in Namche Bazaar, describing their situation and his best estimate of their location. Neither message was transmitted. The attempt was later recorded in the phone log shortly after they took shelter. The 2 hours and 15 minutes that followed were the longest of the day and the least observable from the outside. There were no witnesses and no further communications. The boys remained behind the boulder as the storm moved fully over the ridge, snow accumulating around and on them, while temperatures continued to fall. Hypothermia doesn't really show up in a clean, obvious way while it's happening. It's more gradual and kind of messy from the inside. At first, it usually starts with shivering, and people can get a bit foggy or make worse decisions without really realizing it. As it gets worse, that confusion builds up, and even simple thinking or coordination starts to slip. I don't really know how else to say this, but hypothermia doesn't feel like a moment. It feels like small things slipping. You start shivering, you get slower, your thoughts don't line up cleanly, and you don't really clock how serious it is while it's happening. After a point, motor control gets weaker too, and the body just stops responding the way it should. Eventually, things begin to shut down in stages, and how fast it happens really depends on a lot of things. Wind, how wet or insulated the clothing is, how much energy the person has left, and just their overall condition going into it. At this point, the group was at approximately 15,600 feet on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line, in temperatures estimated between 20 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts approaching 40 miles per hour and heavy wind-driven snowfall. Their clothing was not sufficient for sustained exposure in these conditions. They'd barely eaten anything earlier, and by that point, they'd already been exerting themselves at altitude for hours. That kind of steady shivering in the cold isn't just uncomfortable. It actually drains you faster than you'd expect, until you're just running on empty without realizing how far gone you are. Preston was the one who tried to move first after they stopped. He tried to help Geyser up and push downhill again, but he didn't make it far, maybe about 40 feet, before he just went down on the rocks. He never made it back to the boulder. After that, things get harder to piece together exactly. The positions they were later found in give a general idea of what happened, but not a precise sequence. Just enough to understand they were all collapsing at different stages, not all at once. I don't really know a softer way to put this. Once your coordination starts slipping up there, it's not like you notice it happening in real time. You just slowly stop being able to do simple things, and by the time you realize it, you're already behind it. By that point, they were around 15,800 feet up on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line, roughly 200 feet off the marked trail, in conditions that were steadily worsening with wind and driving snow. Geyser had been struggling the longest. He was found seated against the base of the boulder, knees pulled in, his inhaler in the snow just inches from his hand. Preston was found further downhill, face down on the slope, still away from where they had stopped. Settle stayed at the boulder. He was found seated against it, his camera bag still in his lap, like he never really left that spot once they got there. Cleed was found approximately 6 feet from Settle, lying on his side with his phone in his right hand. The phone screen was dark. A queued emergency text, time-stamped earlier in the afternoon, was present in the messaging log and had not been transmitted. The group was no longer on a clearly defined section of trail, but within an exposed alpine environment on a rocky slope above the tree line. Visibility had deteriorated to near whiteout conditions, and wind-driven snow had obscured terrain features and reference markers. I keep picturing it as their only windbreak at that point, even though it wasn't much, just enough to take the edge off for a moment. And once they stopped moving, the situation just settled into something worse without much resistance. Like the storm finally caught up and stayed there with them. They weren't really sure of their exact position anymore. Movement had pretty much stopped, and all four of them were just stuck there in the cold, with the wind and snow still hitting them hard. And there wasn't any real shelter, no way to communicate out, nothing like that, just open high-altitude terrain, and the storm continuing to build around them. As weather conditions deteriorated later in the afternoon, no other trekkers were visible in the upper alpine sections of the route. No one observed the group leaving the village. No confirmed sightings of the group above the tree line were reported after the weather deteriorated. No distress signal was received or acknowledged. The checkpoint logbook contained no entry for the group. The quiet stone enclosures at the edge of the village remained empty through the evening. Overnight, and into the following morning, gradually accumulating snow. It was Geyser's parents who first identified that something was wrong. They expected him home for Sunday dinner, and when the afternoon passed without contact, his mother called Preston's house. The call went unanswered. She tried again later, with the same result. Geyser's father then walked to Preston's residence, where he found no one home. I keep thinking about Geyser's parents here, because it starts so normal, just waiting for him to show up for Sunday dinner like always. Nothing dramatic about it at all. By early evening, as calls moved between households, inconsistencies began to surface. Clyde's mother had not heard from him. Settle's mother believed he was staying with Clyde. Preston's parents, reached by phone while away, expected him home later that evening. Within a short period, it became clear that none of the boys were where they were supposed to be, and none could be reached. I keep thinking about how it doesn't explode into panic right away. It's more like small, specific calls that slowly stop matching up. Local search and rescue services were contacted later that evening after 4 16-year-old males were reported missing, last confirmed at the Tengbosch trail entrance the previous morning. A photograph posted from one of the boys' accounts, showing the group at the trail marker in clear morning conditions, helped establish their last known departure point. Ground teams reviewed conditions that night and determined that immediate access to the upper alpine zone was unsafe due to ongoing snowfall, wind, and darkness. Search operations were staged for first light. Shortly after sunrise, a helicopter search was launched over the upper valley, while ground teams began climbing toward the area where the boys were believed to have traveled. Conditions above the tree line were clear and cold following the passage of the storm, with fresh snow covering the terrain. Fresh snowfall made visual detection difficult, but search crews eventually spotted a cluster of dark objects partially exposed on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line. Ground teams reached the site shortly afterward and confirmed all 4 individuals deceased. Personal items were found in situ, including a camera bag, a mobile phone, and a medical inhaler recovered near the victims. One individual was located significantly downslope from a sheltered position near a large boulder. Medical findings later attributed the cause of death for all 4 to hypothermia, with one case noting exercise-induced respiratory complications as a contributing factor. No traumatic injuries or toxicological factors were identified, and the incident was classified as accidental. Medical findings indicated the group succumbed to the hypothermia during the evening hours following the storm's arrival. It was July 23, 2016 on K2, the 28,251-foot peak rising in the Karakoram Range near the remote frontier between Pakistan-administered Gilgit-Baltistan and China's Xinjiang region, where steep glacial walls and unstable weather systems dominate the upper mountain. Janessa Cibrian was 31 years old and based in Boulder, Colorado, working as a freelance outdoor photographer, funded through brand partnerships, travel publications, and a growing online audience built around expedition storytelling. She had experience on technical peaks above 18,000 feet, but this was her first attempt on an 8,000-meter summit. In the months before the climb, Janessa developed a summit concept focused on contrast photography. including a white dress image against K2's dark rock and snow. As interest grew, expedition logistics shifted toward supporting filming, with extra camera gear and summit timing tied more closely to media conditions. The team ascended the Abruzzi Spur, a highly exposed route above 26,000 feet where weather, congestion, and narrow margins for error shape every decision. You can tell when gear starts serving the camera more than the climb itself. During acclimatization, progress was generally within expected limits, but guides noted slower recovery and more frequent filming stops. Between Camp 2 and Camp 3, repeated content pauses increased time spent stationary in sub-zero shade, while frequent glove removal for camera use slowed hand recovery and intensified cold exposure effects. By Camp 4, right near the death zone, the forecast was already tightening up, with winds picking up earlier than expected. Even so, the team still went for the summit during one of the busiest climbing windows. By the time everyone funneled into the bottleneck and the traverse, it wasn't really moving anymore. Just long waits on fixed lines, people standing still in brutal wind and cold, hoping the line ahead would finally clear. During a prolonged congestion period, she paused for a brief, filmed segment tied to the summit narrative. Although short in intent, the stop occurred at peak traffic, leaving her stationary on the rope system for an extended interval in temperatures between -15 degrees Fahrenheit and -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind chill. After resuming movement, climbers noted early cold impairment, including reduced dexterity, slower hardware handling, and diminished responsiveness during rope transitions. Everyone around just waits in silence during those bottlenecks. On the descent below the summit traverse, her pace became increasingly uneven. She showed worsening cold stress, slower clipping and unclipping, reduced grip strength, and difficulty maintaining footing on wind-scoured ice. These effects, initially subtle, intensified as exertion rose and oxygen demand increased. Conditions deteriorated further below the bottleneck traverse as visibility dropped, and wind strengthened, with refreezing terrain making movement more technical. She fell behind her climbing partners during an oxygen exchange near a fixed anchor, where delays increased exposure in the death zone. From there, the situation shifted from isolated delay to progressive impairment. Extended static exposure and hypoxia reduced peripheral circulation and fine motor control. Climbers later described difficulty with basic rope tasks, often requiring repeated attempts to clip and adjust gear. As she continued downward, stops became longer and more frequent. Investigators later reconstructed a gradual shutdown consistent with severe hypothermia progression, starting with loss of dexterity, followed by slowed decision-making and reduced coordination, requiring repeated pauses to stabilize equipment between fixed sections. Eventually, she was no longer able to maintain continuous movement with the group. Separated by distance and worsening weather, she became stationary on exposed terrain below the traverse. In this phase, wind exposure, low oxygen saturation, and prior prolonged immobility combined to rapidly reduce functional warmth, particularly in the extremities. Her condition slowly turned into a prolonged hypothermic collapse where she could move less and less until she stopped moving at all. Nearby climbers couldn't safely reach her because of poor visibility, avalanche risk, and unstable conditions along the fixed-line corridor with heavy descent traffic. Her body was recovered during a brief weather window 2 days later below the bottleneck route. Recovery teams documented findings consistent with severe hypothermia following extended high-altitude exposure, along with cold-related tissue damage and minor injuries consistent with uncontrolled movement on steep terrain before death. The expedition review identified a convergence of contributing factors rather than a single point of failure: delayed timing during summit congestion, extended stationary exposure during filming intervals, high-altitude hypoxia, progressive loss of dexterity in extreme cold, and reduced capacity to safely manage descent systems once impairment began. The final assessment described a gradual, exposure-driven failure of function, unfolding during descent, rather than a single acute accident event. It was May 20th, 2017, and the wind across the south col of Mount Everest was already tearing at the tents pitched at 26,000 feet. The south col is the last camp before the summit, a barren saddle of ice and loose rock sitting right at the edge of what climbers call the death zone. The altitude above 26,000 feet, where there is so little oxygen that the human body is quite literally dying the whole time it is up there. Nothing heals at that height, nothing recovers, and every hour spent that high is borrowed against a clock that only ever resets by going down. Above the col stands the final 3,000 feet of the mountain, a steep ramp of snow and ice and rock that climbers move up through the night so they can reach the top in the morning and, if everything goes right, be back down before the afternoon weather rolls in. Almost nobody up there is climbing without bottled oxygen, and almost nobody is climbing without the Sherpa teams who fix the ropes, carry the loads, manage the gas, and quietly make the whole thing survivable for paying clients who could never do it alone. Tate and Sloan Whitlock had paid a great deal of money to be standing on that col. They were 43 and 41 from Scottsdale, Arizona, a married couple who had built a comfortable, photogenic life and a real following around it. He had made his money in medical device sales and carried himself like a man who had never lost an argument he could afford to win. She ran their lifestyle brand, the trips, the gear, the carefully lit mornings, and had turned the two of them into the kind of couple other people screenshot and envy. Everest was supposed to be the crown on all of it, the highest, the hardest, the one that would make every other post they had ever made look small. The thing you have to understand about them is that they did not see this climb the way a real mountaineer sees it, as something earned slowly over years of smaller peaks and a whole lot of humility. They saw it as a thing they had purchased, like a first-class seat or a table that should have been ready and waiting the moment they walked in. And in their world, when you pay enough for something, the people around it exist to make it go smoothly, not to ever tell you no. I've watched people treat a summit like a product they ordered online, and it never once goes the way they think it will. They had been collecting summits for a few years, the way certain people collect them, with heavy guiding and fixed ropes and a team of professionals doing the genuinely dangerous work, while the client simply walks the route between them. There's nothing wrong with that on its own. Plenty of good, humble people climb exactly that way and treat the staff around them like the experts they are. The Whitlocks did not. They had shown up at base camp already, certain they knew enough, complaining about the food, complaining about the pace of the acclimatization rotations, and sitting through the safety briefings like people enduring a fire drill rather than absorbing information that might one day keep them alive. The hardest thing for a certain kind of wealthy client to accept about a mountain like this is that it is the one room they will ever walk into where their money buys them almost nothing that matters. It can buy the permit, the tents, the oxygen, and the finest guides on Earth. It cannot buy a body that has acclimatized. It cannot buy the judgment that comes from years of smaller climbs. And it absolutely cannot buy the humility to do what a more experienced person tells you when your own life is on the line. Everything the Whitlocks had ever used to get everything they wanted was useless above 26,000 feet, and they had no idea because nothing in their lives had ever once required them to find out. I want to be careful. Plenty of paying clients are humble and kind, but these two had decided the mountain owed them a summit. The man assigned to lead them to the top was named Pemba Rinzin. He was 39, born in a village in the Khumbu Valley, in the shadow of the same peaks he now climbed for a living, and he had stood on the summit of Everest 11 separate times. He had been turned back by weather. He had carried sick climbers down on his own back. He had watched people die up high, and he had a quiet, exact way of reading the mountain and the sky that came from a lifetime of paying very close attention to both. By any honest measure, he was one of the most qualified human beings on the entire mountain that season. Pemba did not climb for the glory of it, the way the clients often imagined. He climbed because it was the best work available to a man from his valley, work that paid for his daughter's schooling down in Kathmandu, and kept the roof on his parents' house in the Khumbu, and he was very good at it. Good in the patient, unshowy way of a person whose entire job is to bring other people home alive. He had a wife and 2 girls who watched the weather reports during the climbing season, the way the families of fishermen watch the sea. Everything careful about him, every slow step and rationed breath and nervous glance at the sky came from the simple fact that he fully intended to see them again. And the Whitlocks treated him like the help. They never quite learned his name, called him by 2 or 3 wrong ones across the whole expedition, and never once corrected themselves. And whenever he spoke, careful and accented and precise, they would share a little look with each other, the kind of look that says, "Isn't this quaint?" as if his caution were a charming local custom and not the single most valuable thing on the mountain. It turns my stomach that they couldn't be bothered to learn the name of the one man who could keep them breathing up there. Pemba had led clients like this before, and he had a way of working with them that did not depend on them respecting him at all. He simply did his job, watched them closely, and kept his own counsel. He knew that the things which actually mattered up high were not opinions. They were facts. The rate the oxygen burned, the speed the weather built, the hours showing on the clock. And he intended to manage every one of them, whether the Whitlocks appreciated it or not. On the afternoon of May 20th, they rested at the South Col as well as anyone can rest at that altitude, and a little before 10 that night, into a hard cold wind and a sky scattered with stars, they clipped into the fixed line and started up. It had been like that the whole way up the mountain. On the lower slopes, weeks earlier, Pemba and the other Sherpas had done the heaviest and most dangerous work of the entire expedition, ferrying loads through the icefall in the small hours when the ice is most stable, fixing and checking the ropes, building the camps, doing the quiet, invisible labor that turns a deadly mountain into something a paying client can survive. The Whitlocks had walked through all of it as though it were a hotel that had simply assembled itself around them. When Pemba had once gently slowed Tate on a steep section to fix his footing, Tate had shrugged him off and complained to the operator that his guide was treating him like a beginner. They had come to be served, and a man trying to keep them alive kept getting in the way of the experience they had paid for. The climb out of the South Col in the dark is its own strange world. Everything shrinks to the small circle of a headlamp and the boots of the person ahead. The cold finds every gap in your clothing and settles into your bones with the wind pushing it well past 40 degrees below zero, and the only sounds are the crampons biting the ice, the hiss of the oxygen, and your own breath loud inside the mask. Pemba set a pace that felt, to the Whitlocks, insultingly slow. It was not slow. It was the exact pace the math of the night demanded, the pace that would get them to the top with enough oxygen left in the bottles to also get them back down, which is the only part of any summit that has ever really mattered. I admire that his slow pace was really survival math, the exact speed that gets a body home, and they read it as weakness. Here's the thing about bottled oxygen that the Whitlocks never once bothered to understand. You do not carry enough of it to breathe freely and easily. You carry a careful, rationed amount set to a low flow and calculated to last the entire long round trip, up and back down. And the single fastest way to die high on that mountain is to burn through it before you are safely down. Pemba had set their regulators to a conservative flow and told them, as plainly as he could, to leave them exactly there. For the first couple of hours they did, but they were cold and they were working hard, and the low flow made them feel weak and slow. And somewhere on the dark slope below the balcony, out of his sight, first Tate and then Sloan reached down and quietly turned their own regulators up. It felt wonderful. The extra oxygen flooded in, the strength came back into their legs, and suddenly the careful pace felt ridiculous to them. An old man dawdling on an easy hill, and they began to push, surging ahead on the fixed line, pleased with themselves, more certain than ever that they had been right all along about how easy this really was. Strung out above and below them on the dark slope were the headlamps of the other climbers and their Sherpas, a thin line of small lights crawling up the side of the mountain, every one of them running the same desperate clock. Up there the body is starving for oxygen, no matter what the bottle gives it. The brain is slower, the hands are clumsier, and the simplest tasks, clipping a carabiner or swapping a glove, take twice as long and twice the will. This was the environment the Whitlocks had decided they understood better than the man who had survived it 11 times. It is an environment that does not care in the slightest what you believe about yourself, where confidence and competence are two completely different things, and only one of them keeps you alive. I can't stand how good that extra oxygen must have felt, because feeling strong up there on borrowed gas is exactly the hook being set. Pemba saw it almost at once, the way they surged, the new energy that had no business existing on the flow he had set. He caught up, checked their gauges, and saw the needles sitting far lower than they should have been for that point on the route. He told them, in the plainest words he had, that they were burning their summit oxygen and their descent oxygen all at the same time, that the bottles would never stretch if they kept this up. They waved him off. They had paid for oxygen, they reminded him, and they intended to breathe it. And they did not appreciate being rationed like children on a mountain they had spent a small fortune to climb. That is the part I sit with, that he told them the actual life and death truth, in the simplest words he could find, and they heard it as a man being difficult. To them it was a customer service problem, a guide overstepping. To him it was a countdown that had already started. What stuns me is he handed them the truth, and to them it just registered as a man overstepping his place. They reached the balcony, a small shelf of snow at around 27,600 feet, just as the first gray of dawn came into the sky, and that was where Pemba began watching the weather, as closely as he watched the clock. Far to the west, out over the shoulder of the mountain, a long, smooth, lens-shaped cloud was forming and sitting on the wind, the kind of cloud that means nothing to someone who does not know what they are looking at, and means everything to someone who does. It is the signature of a rising wind, high above, the jet stream dropping its edge back down onto the peak, and it is one of the oldest warnings the mountain knows how to give. Pemba had turned around on the sight of that exact cloud before, and he was alive partly because of it. He told them they needed to think hard right now about turning around. They were behind on time, they were low on oxygen, they should still have had plenty of, and the sky was beginning to tell him the afternoon would turn violent. The summit was still more than 1,000 feet above them, hours away at their real pace, and every one of those feet would have to be paid back on the way down. He laid all of it out as clearly as a man can lay anything out, and they laughed at him. They actually laughed, the two of them, standing up there in the thin gray light, because to them, a pretty little cloud and a nervous guide were simply not a reason to walk away from the most expensive photograph of their entire lives. They told him the weather looked perfectly fine. They told him he was being dramatic, that he obviously wanted an easy day, that this was exactly the sort of overcaution they had paid extra to rise above. It wrecks me that he read the sky perfectly, said the one thing that saves them, and they answered like he was canceling dinner. Pemba was their guide, not their jailer. On a guided climb, the final decision to keep going up still belongs to the client, and a Sherpa who physically drags a paying couple off the mountain against their will does not have a job to come home to. He had said the words. He had said them more than once, as plainly as they could be said. The Whitlocks heard the words and chose the summit anyway, and so Pemba did the only thing left to him, which was to stay close and try to keep two people alive who had just overruled the one person actually qualified to make the call. They clipped on and kept climbing into a sky that was quietly turning against them. There is a thing in mountaineering that experienced climbers will tell you is harder than any physical part of the climb, and that is the discipline of turning around. The mountain is right there. You can see it. You have spent years and a fortune and every ounce of yourself to get this close, and walking away from a summit you could almost touch is the hardest decision in the entire sport. That is exactly why so many of the dead on these peaks are found above their turnaround time, and not below it. Strong and capable people who simply could not make themselves stop a few hundred feet from the top. Pemba knew that trap better than anyone, and he was watching two people who had never once in their lives been told no walk straight into it. I wish the mountain had some rule that could overrule a customer, but the awful part is that up there, it really doesn't. The last stretch to the top of Everest is the most exposed ground most people will ever stand on in their lives. The route runs along a knife of a ridge, with a sheer drop of thousands of feet down one side into Tibet, and thousands more down the other into Nepal, past the south summit, across a narrow corniced traverse, and up the famous step just below the summit before the final snow slope to the top. It is slow, technical, and completely unforgiving, and the Whitlocks moved across it far more slowly than they believed they were moving, because the oxygen they had wasted was running thin now, and the altitude was dulling them in ways they could not feel from the inside. It was already past the middle of the day when they finally stood on the summit of the world, and for a few minutes, it was everything they had pictured. The whole earth fell away beneath their boots, the curve of the horizon, the brown plateau of Tibet on one side, and the green valleys of Nepal on the other, and they got their photographs, the flags, the poses, the brand moment of a lifetime captured at 29,000 feet. But the light was already wrong. The smooth cloud Pemba had spotted at dawn had grown and spread, and was climbing the mountain toward them. The wind had a new edge in it that had not been there an hour before, and the warmth of standing on top was already curdling into the cold dread of a man who knew exactly how late it had gotten. They had also taken far too long to get there. The traffic on the fixed lines, the awkward, oxygen-starved fumbling at every transition, the photos they kept stopping for, all of it had eaten the morning, and they had topped out hours later than any safe schedule allows. Up high, time is not just time. It is oxygen burning and weather building and daylight bleeding away. And every minute they had spent celebrating was a minute stolen from the descent. They still had to survive. Pemba had watched the clock the whole way up with a quiet, growing dread, because he understood what the numbers meant, even when the Whitlocks could not feel them. They believed they had won. He knew they were only very far from finished. I think the saddest image in this whole story is that summit photo. Two people grinning on top of the world, already never going home. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of that mountain, the thing every experienced climber carries in their bones. The summit is not the goal. It is the halfway point, and it is the halfway point reached at your most exhausted and most depleted, with the harder, deadlier half still ahead of you, and the weather getting worse by the minute. Far more people die on Everest going down than ever die coming up, and they die for exactly the reasons that were now stacking themselves against the Whitlocks. They started down, and within minutes the mountain collapsed into white. The cloud Pemba had read at dawn swallowed the upper ridge whole, and the world that had been endless and clear from the summit became a roaring, blinding nothing, wind-driven snow erasing the route only a few feet in front of their faces. This is the exact scenario that kills people up there. The descent from the summit caught in a whiteout, when the fixed line and the boot pack are the only things tying a climber to the safe path down, and everything past them is a void falling away in every direction. It scares me how cleanly the mountain hides the danger behind the summit, because the top feels like the finish when it's barely halftime, and now the oxygen ran out. First Tate's bottle, then Sloane's. The gas they had been so eager to breathe down, finally gone, far above the safety of the coal, and there was nothing left to give them, because the high flow they had run all day had burned clean through the whole supply, the spare bottles included. Without it, at that altitude, in that cold, the change in them was fast and terrifying. Their movements went clumsy and slow. Their thinking, already dulled, started to come apart at the seams. Hypoxia at that height does not simply exhaust a person. It takes the judgment first, the starved brain turning slow and stubborn, and sometimes openly hostile, so that the very moment they most needed to listen was the moment they had become least able to. The moment the gas runs dry is the one I can't shake, because everything after it was already decided when they laughed at him. This is how the worst disasters on this mountain have almost always unfolded. Not one dramatic catastrophe, but a slow stacking of small, ordinary failures, a late start, a little too much oxygen burned too soon, a warning brushed aside, until a climber is standing exhausted and blind in a storm on the most dangerous ground on earth with no margin left for a single mistake. Up there, a person does not have to do anything spectacular to die. They only have to lose the rope, or take one step in the wrong direction, or sit down to rest in a place where sitting down is the same as giving up. The Whitlocks were now doing very nearly all of it at once, and this is the cruelest knot in the whole thing, because now the arrogance and the altitude were pulling in the exact same direction. A humble person would still have been impaired up there, of course, but a humble person would have spent the whole climb listening, would have trusted the man beside them on pure instinct, and might well have been led down on reflex alone. The Whitlocks had spent the entire mountain training themselves to ignore him. It guts me that the one habit that saves them, just trusting Pemba, was the exact habit they'd refused to build all climb. Pemba did everything a human being can do up there. He fought his way to them in the whiteout and tried to clip them firmly back onto the fixed line, the single thread connecting them to the route down, and he tried to short rope them, to tie them directly to his own harness so he could control their descent and catch them if either one fell, which is the standard thing a guide does for a failing client on lethal ground. It is not an insult. It is the most protective act one climber can offer another, and even then, even blind and freezing and dying on their feet, some broken mix of their pride and their hypoxia made them fight him on it. Sloane wrenched herself free of the short rope, snapping that she would not be hauled around like a piece of luggage. And Tate, confused and belligerent, and barely himself anymore, reached down and unclipped his own harness from the fixed line in the middle of the whiteout, the one thing that absolutely no one is ever supposed to do up there, because he wanted to move his own way and would not be tied to anyone. Now neither of them was attached to anything at all, not the line, not the rope, not Pemba. He was already lunging for them, shouting into the wind for them to clip back in, when Tate, with Sloane only a step behind him, walked onto ground he could not see, ground that was not the road at all, and the slope he expected to be under his boot simply was not. I've read this part more times than I should, and I still can't believe he undid the one clip tying him to the living world. He fell, and the rope he had refused to be tied into was not there to catch him, and Sloane, unroped now herself and barely a step away, lunged for him on pure instinct and went off the edge with him, the two of them gone into the white in the space of a single breath. Pemba threw himself forward and got a gloved hand on a trailing strap and felt it tear straight through his fingers, and then there was nothing at all. No weight, no rope, just the wind and the snow and the empty place on the ridge where two people had been standing a heartbeat before. They fell thousands of feet down the face of the mountain, dead within seconds of shoving away the very last hand that was trying to hold on to them. Pemba Rinzin somehow brought himself down alive, frostbitten and broken, and radioed what had happened to the team below. The expedition operator notified the local authorities and the Whitlock's family, and the slow, grim work of a high-altitude death began, the part the brochures never show. Recovering a body from a fall like that, on that terrain, in the death zone, is a mission that risks the lives of the living, and on the highest mountain on Earth, it very often cannot be done at all. The mountain the Whitlocks believed they had bought a clean passage up had simply kept them. It haunts me that the man they mocked the entire way up was the only reason anyone on Earth ever learned how they died. The man they had mocked the entire climb, whose name they never once managed to say right, was the only reason anyone ever knew what happened on that ridge. He had been right about the pace, the oxygen, the cloud at dawn, the rope, every single thing they laughed at, and he stayed with them to the last second, trying to undo choices that were never his to make. They had spent a fortune and a lifetime of certainty to stand on top of the world, and the one thing that could have carried them home was the single thing their money could not buy, and their pride would not let them take, the humility to listen to the man who knew the way down. It was July 29th, 2013, on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, standing within the Karakoram Range in the far northern reaches of the region bordering Pakistan and China, where deep avalanche-prone valleys feed into one of the most technically demanding high-altitude environments in the world. Lisha Huesca was 36 years old and based in Seattle, Washington, working as a videographer specializing in outdoor wedding films and remote elopement documentation. Her career had gradually expanded from accessible wilderness filming into high-altitude alpine environments, with K2 representing the furthest extension of that progression. She had prior experience on Denali and Cho Oyu, but limited exposure to sustained technical climbing at extreme altitude. The expedition was structured as a documentary project that initially included a lightweight dress concept tied to pre-expedition promotional material and sponsorship expectations for summit imagery. Early into the climb, she ended up dropping the dress before the higher camps once it became clear it just wasn't practical in those conditions. It did lighten her load, but it also left her with this lingering mental pressure, like the story she'd built around the summit didn't quite match what was actually happening on the mountain anymore. She joined a commercial expedition using shared fixed-line infrastructure across the upper route, where multiple teams converged during narrow weather windows, creating congestion in key technical sections of the ascent. Things quickly stacked up here. Too many people, too little space. From early rotations, she carried filming equipment alongside standard climbing gear, increasing fatigue and slowing recovery between camps. As altitude increased, cold exposure and oxygen limitation began compounding normal exertion, reducing efficiency during repeated climbs and descents between camps. At higher elevations near the start of the death zone, extended exposure during congested fixed-line sections led to prolonged stationary periods in extreme cold. Without the added insulation buffer originally planned for the summit concept, she relied entirely on standard expedition layering, which became increasingly marginal under wind and static exposure conditions. By the summit rotation, weather conditions deteriorated beyond forecast expectations. Wind speeds increased and temperatures dropped further during the summit window, while congestion along fixed ropes forced repeated stops in exposed positions. These pauses increased total time spent immobile, limiting the body's ability to maintain core temperature. During descent, her pace became progressively more conservative, The earlier decision to abandon the dress removed a physical hazard, but did not resolve the psychological tension tied to the summit narrative. Climbers later noted she adopted a cautious, delayed rhythm at anchor transitions, prioritizing stability over group pace. This conservative pacing gradually separated her from faster-moving teams on the fixed lines. Sometimes slowing down feels safer, even when it quietly puts distance between people. As separation increased, she entered sections of the route alone, or with reduced visual contact with other climbers. Intermittent weather changes reduced visibility and erased clear reference points along the rope corridor. When conditions briefly worsened, she stopped at a fixed anchor to wait for regrouping that never fully reformed. That stop ended up dragging on as the wind picked up and the temperature kept dropping. With no safe way to move alone and already struggling to stay warm after sitting still for so long, she stayed put through the night as conditions got worse. With limited movement, repeated glove exposure during minor gear adjustments, and reduced caloric and thermal recovery capacity at altitude, her ability to rewarm declined steadily. The psychological hesitancy that had begun earlier in descent translated into delayed decision-making, keeping her stationary rather than committing to risky movement in low visibility. By morning, she was no longer responsive to changing conditions along the route. Recovery was only possible during a later weather window when teams regained access to the section. She was found in a stationary position along the descent line, consistent with prolonged exposure rather than a single traumatic event. The expedition review identified a sequence of contributing factors: abandonment of the dress early in the climb, removing a physical hazard but leaving an unresolved psychological anchor in her decision-making, conservative pacing during descent leading to gradual separation from the group, and eventual forced isolation during worsening weather. The final assessment concluded that the fatal outcome resulted from cumulative exposure and stationary overnight hypothermia, where the primary mechanism was not a discrete accident, but a progressive inability to transition from caution into movement in a collapsing weather window. It was May 13th, 2022, and night was coming down hard on the south col of Mount Everest, the last camp before the summit. A frozen saddle of rock and ice sitting at almost 26,000 feet. The col is the doorway to what climbers call the death zone, the altitude where the air is so thin that the human body starts dying faster than it can repair itself, and where nearly every climber on Earth straps on a mask and breathes bottled oxygen just to keep their brain and their fingers alive. The gas does not make the climbing easy, it makes it possible, propping up judgment, warmth, and strength in a place determined to take all three. All across camp that evening, headlamps moved between tents as people checked regulators and counted cylinders for the summit push. And in the middle of all of it, one climber zipped open her tent, stepped out into the wind, and walked right past the stacked bottles with her face bare. Her name was Janelle Pruitt. She was 36 from Boulder, Colorado, and she was nobody's idea of a tourist. She had stood on top of Rainier in a storm, climbed Denali carrying her own loads, summited Aconcagua, and tagged a respectable Himalayan peak the year before. She ran marathons for fun and trained like it was a second job. Winters meant ice routes before dawn and weighted stair climbs after work. Summers meant an altitude tent over her bed, and weekends spent grinding up high peaks with a loaded pack. People who climbed with her described a woman who was strong, organized, and absolutely certain of herself. The kind of partner who never complained and never slowed down. On paper, she was exactly the sort of climber a guide wants on the rope. But here's the thing you have to understand about Janelle before any of this makes sense. She did not really come to Everest to climb a mountain. She came to follow a man. For most of her adult life, she had worshipped one legendary climber the way other people worship prophets. And somewhere along the way, the goal quietly stopped being the summit and became the style, doing it his way, proving she was cut from the same cloth he was. Admiring your heroes is healthy, but I watched her admiration grow into a plan to copy the hardest climb on Earth, and I mean copy it move for move, as if the 40 years in between did not exist. In 1978, a climber named Reinhold Messner and his partner Peter Habeler did something doctors of the era had called flatly impossible. They reached the summit of Mount Everest without bottled oxygen. Physiologists had warned that a human brain simply could not survive that altitude unassisted, that anyone who tried would come back damaged, or not come back at all. When the two men walked back into base camp alive and lucid, they did not just break a record, they broke a belief, and the climbing world spent years arguing about what it meant. 2 years later, Messner returned and did it again, completely alone. He would eventually stand on all 14 of the planet's highest mountains, the giants rising past 26,000 feet, every single one of them without gas, under a philosophy he became famous for, climbing the mountain by fair means or not at all. Janelle owned everything he had ever written. She could recite his routes and his dates the way other people recite song lyrics, and over the years his philosophy had hardened inside her into something close to scripture. To her, bottled oxygen was not safety equipment. It was a shortcut, a way of dragging the summit down to your level instead of rising to meet it. She liked to say, in so many words, that the gas turned the tallest mountain on Earth into a treadmill, and that the long lines of masked climbers shuffling up the ropes every May were not really climbing Everest at all. By the time she reached base camp, everyone on the mountain seemed to know about the American woman planning to go up clean, and she wore the attention like a down suit. Messner spent 20 years building a body that could survive up there, and I cannot stress enough she only had 6 weeks. What she never fully weighed was everything underneath his style. Messner grew up climbing in the Dolomites as a small child and had thousands of routes behind him before he ever saw the Himalaya. He spent years on expedition after expedition, letting his body learn the thin air, the slow way, and he carried a once-in-a-generation engine that no training plan on Earth can manufacture. He also paid for those lessons in ways she preferred not to dwell on, losing his own brother on a mountain and 7 of his toes to frostbite long before Everest. His climbs without oxygen were not a costume you could put on. They were the last page of a very long book. None of it was secret either. It was all printed plainly in the books on her own shelf, page after page. And there was one more thing buried in all those books she loved, something she read right past. The man turned around, constantly. He walked away from summits when the snow felt wrong, when the weather shifted, when his body whispered that the margin was gone, and he never treated those retreats as failures. He treated them as the reason he was still breathing. The style she idolized was never really about refusing oxygen. It was about reading the mountain and himself with brutal honesty and having the humility to go home. Makalu turned him back again and again before he ever reached the top. Dhaulagiri threw him off twice across the years before it finally let him up, and he obeyed the mountain every single time. People forget how often Messner simply turned around, and those retreats were the one skill I never saw her copy. Going home was never failure to him. It was the whole system. Janelle arrived at base camp with 6 weeks of acclimatization ahead of her, a marathon runner's heart, a backpack of conviction, and almost none of that. Her resume was real, but it was thin in exactly the place this plan needed it to be: thick. Time spent desperately high with no help. She had never been above 25,000 feet in her life. The plan was simple and absolute. She would climb with the team, but from the high camps upward, where every other client would be sleeping and climbing on bottled oxygen, she would touch none of it. The rare climbers who truly pull this off tend to share a profile, a decade of Himalayan seasons, earlier trips above 26,000 feet on bottled oxygen first, and a long record of turning around. She was trying to skip straight to the final exam, and I will be honest with you, on paper the plan did not look insane. It looked disciplined. It had checkpoints and contingencies, neat little rows of them. That is the trap with plans like hers. Paper holds anything you write on it. Paper does not have to breathe at 26,000 feet, and paper has never once been cold. The expedition she joined was run by a veteran leader named Neil Crowder, a quiet man in his 50s with more than 2 decades of Himalayan seasons behind him. And when she told him her intention, he spent the better part of the spring trying to talk her out of it. He had guided strong climbers without gas before, and he told her plainly what separated them from her: years of high rotations, previous trips above 26,000 feet, and a willingness to quit on a moment's notice. She heard all of it the way a believer hears doubt, politely, warmly, and not at all. He even connected her, through mutual friends, with climbers who had actually done Everest without gas, and every one of them told her some version of the same thing. Wait a few years. Climb another giant first. Build the base. She thanked them all and changed nothing. Each time she called bottled oxygen cheating, I wanted to remind her that gas is why most people come home. Crowder could not legally or physically stop a paying client from breathing the air, so he did what good leaders do. He built fences around the risk. She would climb on a strict schedule with hard checkpoints. She would carry a radio and answer it, and whether she liked it or not, a rescue bottle of oxygen with a mask and regulator would travel a few steps behind her the entire way, carried by the strongest climbing Sherpa on his team. Janelle resented that bottle the way some people resent an insult. To her, it was not a lifeline. It was an accusation. There would be a hard turnaround time. There would be radio checks at fixed points along the route, and if her speech slurred or her walk wandered, even once, the climb was over on the spot, whether she agreed with the verdict or not. The man assigned to carry it was Mingma, 34 years old, from the village of Forts in the Khumbu Valley, a place that has sent more climbers to the top of Everest than entire countries have. He had 9 summits of his own, every one of them on the sharp end of someone else's ambition, and he had carried clients, hauled loads, and once helped drag a stranger back down from the balcony in a storm. Crowder told him, in so many words, that his only job on summit night was Janelle. Stay close, stay patient, and keep that bottle ready. Neil, her expedition leader, ordered a rescue bottle carried behind her, and that order tells me he saw this coming. Nobody packs a rescue for a climb they believe in. The warnings started weeks before the summit push, and they were not subtle. On the acclimatization rotations, Janelle moved beautifully low on the mountain, and then slowed, hard, every time the team pushed above 23,000 feet. She picked up the dry, hacking cough that haunts every Everest season, except hers kept settling deeper into her chest, turning wet around the edges. And the numbers told their own story. Every camp had a little fingertip pulse oximeter, the cheap drugstore kind, and camp by camp, the oxygen saturation readings it gave her slid lower than anyone else's on the team. Crowder watched the spread between her readings, and everyone else's widened with every rotation, and he started sleeping worse than she did. She had an answer for all of it. The slowing was pacing, she said. The patience of someone climbing by fair means. The cough was just the dry air, the same cough everyone gets. The numbers were a snapshot, not a verdict, and anyway, her hero had climbed into that same air with no oximeter at all. Every symptom that should have been read as a warning got reframed in her head as evidence of effort, proof that she was doing it the hard way, the right way, his way. It is the oldest trap in mountaineering and the most polite one, because nobody around you can prove your story wrong until the mountain does. Her oxygen numbers were screaming at everyone in camp, and it floors me that only she was not listening. Belief is a painkiller. That is the best way I can put it. A strong enough belief will quietly swallow every signal your body sends you and hand you back a story you like better. Janelle was not lying to anyone. She had simply built a version of events where struggling meant succeeding, and inside that version, the worse she felt, the more like him she became. The summit push began in the second week of May, and this is where her path split from everyone else's. The route climbs out of Camp 2 and up the steep blue ice of the Lhotse face to Camp 3, hanging off the slope at about 23,500 feet. And it is there that most clients strap on the mask for the first time and sleep with the gas whispering all night. Sleep is where the gas earns its keep, because a climber resting on oxygen actually recovers a little, while a climber on ambient air at that height just deteriorates more slowly lying down than standing up. Janelle slept on ambient air. The next day she climbed on ambient air over the yellow band and the Geneva spur to the South Col itself, while her body quietly fell behind on a debt it had no way to repay. Watching her climb past 23,000 feet with no gas, I knew she was burning strength she could never get back. By the time she stumbled into camp on the Col, on the afternoon of May 13th, she had spent more than a full day above 23,000 feet with no oxygen, and the woman who arrived was not the woman who had left base camp. Teammates watched her take 20 minutes to get her boots off. She could not finish a cup of soup. The cough had gone fully wet, a low rattle riding under every breath, and when she talked, there were pauses in the middle of her sentences where the air simply ran out. She called it tired. The mountain had another word for it. 2 separate teammates went to Crowder that evening, independently, and told him quietly that something was wrong with Janelle. He already knew. In the leader's tent that evening, Crowder did what he had done every night of the expedition and clipped the little oximeter onto her finger. At home, a healthy person reads somewhere in the high 90s. Down at base camp, most of the team had been in the 80s. Climbers resting on bottled oxygen a few tents away were holding in the low 80s, even there, at the edge of the death zone. The number that came back on Janelle's finger started with a 5. He showed it to her without a word, and she looked at it. And what she did next told him everything. She smiled. A blood oxygen level in the 50s would land me in intensive care, but she read hers and smiled. She read a medical emergency like it was a progress report. He laid it out for her one last time, slowly, the way you talk when you need every word to land. The readings, the cough, the rattle he could hear from across the tent. He told her the climb was over, that there were exactly 2 acceptable versions of tomorrow. One where she clipped on a mask and went up like everyone else, and one where she turned around and went down, and that the version she wanted no longer existed. He had buried friends on this mountain. He knew precisely what her body was telling him. Years earlier, he had watched a strong climber die of this exact arithmetic, less than a day after insisting he felt fine, and he told her that story straight to her face. Janelle heard him out, and then she told him, in so many words, that she had not spent 2 years and every dollar she had to climb the world's tallest mountain on a bottle, that the whole point of being here was to do it clean, and that she felt better than the numbers said. He could not handcuff her to a tent. Nepal requires climbers to have support, but no rule on earth lets a guide physically force a determined adult downhill. So Crowder made the only move left on the board. He doubled Mingma's orders, tightened the checkpoints, and prayed she would quit on her own. He gave her one final chance to put on a mask, and I wish ego came with an off switch. At 9:40 that night, the team assembled in the dark to begin the summit push. A procession of headlamps and down suits shuffling toward the fixed line, the wind driving the temperature to 30 below zero before it even started trying. One by one, climbers seated their masks, opened their regulators, and let the gas warm them from the inside. Summit pushes leave at night on purpose. The snow is frozen solid, the wind is usually at its kindest, and the timing puts climbers on top in morning light, with a whole day to get back down. Their world narrowed to the hiss of oxygen and the circle of light at their feet. Janelle stepped into that line with her face open to the night. No mask, no hose, no hiss, just a balaclava crusting with frost around her mouth, and the rattle in her chest that everyone pretended not to hear. Mingma fell in a few steps behind her, the rescue bottle riding in his pack, exactly where Crowder had ordered it to be. The clock that no one knew was running started right there, at the edge of camp, at 9:40 in the evening. Climbers from other teams glanced at her uncovered face as they passed, then glanced again, the way drivers look at a car heading the wrong way up a ramp. One bare face in a line of oxygen masks, heading into a -30 night, is an image I cannot unsee. And for the first stretch she held. That is the part nobody who was there can quite let go of. For about 20 minutes, Janelle kept pace with the masked climbers around her, even edging past 1 or 2, looking far steadier than a person in her state had any right to be. The slope above the col is a long, rising ramp of snow and rock, and for those 20 minutes, she went up it like a woman who had finally been proven right about everything. What was actually happening inside her was crueler. Severe oxygen starvation does not always announce itself with pain. At first it can feel like clarity, even mild euphoria, the brain running light and fast right before it begins to fail. The strength she felt in those first 20 minutes was not her body thriving on thin air. It was her body burning its last full tank, and there was no station anywhere above her to refill it. Pilots get warned about this in training, because hypoxia famously convinces its victims they are doing wonderfully, right up until they are not doing anything at all. Those strong first 20 minutes were not strength at all, and I hate that the body lies before it fails. Hypoxia flatters you right up until it drops you. Around 10:15, the engine ceased. Her pace did not fade gradually, it fell off a shelf. 3 steps, then a long sagging pause over her ice axe. 2 steps, then 1. The climbers she had passed so easily came grinding back up to her and moved by, 1 set of headlamps at a time, until she was standing alone in the dark with Mingma, gulping at air that gave her almost nothing back. The men who first climbed this mountain without gas wrote about taking 10 breaths for a single upward step. Mingma moved up beside her and asked, gently, if she wanted the bottle. She shook her head and made herself climb. He dropped back and radioed Crowder, who was climbing a few minutes below, and the 2 men began the quiet choreography that experienced climbers know too well, closing the distance around a person who is coming apart, without saying out loud that it is happening. Above them, the route to the balcony went on, rising into the night, more than 1,500 vertical feet of it that she was never going to see. 10 breaths for every single step is how the strongest climbers alive describe that altitude, and I promise she was not them. Then the cold came inside. This is the part of climbing without oxygen that almost nobody appreciates. The gas is not just breath, it is heat. A body-burning, bottled oxygen can defend its core and push warm blood out to its fingers and toes. A body starved of it cannot, and the cold knows. At 30 below, in wind, the difference is not measured in comfort. It is measured in minutes. Frostbite that takes hours to develop on bottled oxygen can take root in minutes without it, and hers had a head start on a body that could no longer fight back. By 10:30, Janelle had stopped flexing her right hand. Her shivering, which had been violent, was easing, and any mountain medic will tell you that on a night like that, shivering that stops is not improvement, it is surrender. Frost had sealed across her balaclava. Mingma offered the bottle a second time, holding the mask out where she could see it. She pushed his arm away, and her arm, teammates said later, moved like it belonged to someone else. Without the gas, the body cannot even keep itself warm, and the cold taking her fingers first just broke me. By 11:15, she was weaving. Her boots crossed each other. She tipped into the slope, caught herself on the fixed line, stood swaying, and tried to step up again. When Mingma reached her, she was mumbling, and the words came out soft and wrong, like a tape played at the wrong speed. The medical term for what was happening is ataxia, the brain so starved of oxygen that it can no longer run the legs, and on Everest it is famous for one reason. It is usually the last warning a climber ever gets. Mingma keyed the radio and said the words Crowder had been dreading more all season, and the night reorganized itself around her in seconds. Crowder turned his clients around to hold position. 2 Sherpas from a neighboring team angled across the slope to help. Janelle, a few hundred feet above the tents she had walked out of an hour before, was still trying to climb, one knee in the snow, one mitten pawing at the line, chasing a man who had done this 44 years earlier and chasing him on legs that no longer answered, stumbling like someone 6 drinks deep. She still waved the oxygen away, and I have never wanted to shout louder, and by that point I am not even sure the refusal was still her. At 11 o'clock, she sat down in the snow, the way exhausted climbers do, and then she could not get up. Would not, could not. She was at roughly 26,500 feet, 400 vertical feet above camp, an hour and 20 minutes after walking out of it. Her eyes were open, and they were aimed at nothing. The rattle in her chest had become a wet, doubled sound that the men around her could hear over the wind, her lungs filling with the fluid of severe altitude sickness. The kind of failure the doctors of 1978 had feared, arriving right on schedule in a body that had none of the armor. Mingma, her Sherpa, got the oxygen mask on her in under a minute, and it guts me she was past saving. Mingma had the mask out of his pack and sealed over her face in under a minute. The regulator opened all the way, pure oxygen pouring into her at last. It was the one moment her whole philosophy had called cheating, and it changed nothing because the body receiving it was already past the line. They got her onto a tarp and started hauling her down toward the tents. 4 men skidding and heaving on a frozen slope in the dark, and partway down, her breathing went ragged and then shallow, and then, at about 11:25, it stopped. There is no reviving a person up there. No machine, no medicine, no miracle. The altitude takes even that option away. Janelle Pruitt had walked out of camp at 9:40. She was gone within 2 hours, 400 feet above her own sleeping bag with the oxygen mask on her face. She died maybe 400 feet above a camp full of oxygen, and that distance will stay with me. That is a slope she could have walked down in 20 minutes. The men carried her body the rest of the way down to the col, which on that mountain counts as a mercy, and the expedition operator radioed the news down through the camps to the local authorities and eventually to a phone in Boulder, Colorado. The rest of the team abandoned the summit and descended in silence. Days later, a team of Sherpas brought her down the Lhotse face to Camp 2, where a long-line helicopter lifted her off the mountain, and unlike so many of the people Everest keeps, Janelle Pruitt went home. She went home because of the men she had spent the whole climb quietly defying, the leader who fenced in her risk, and the Sherpa who shadowed her with the bottle she called an insult. And that is the bitter center of this story. The man she worshipped earned the right to refuse oxygen across 20 years of mountains and stayed alive by turning around over and over whenever the math went bad. Janelle copied the refusal and skipped everything underneath it. She wanted his summit without his scars, his style without his retreats, and the mountain, which has never once cared what anyone believes, simply ran the numbers. Somewhere in Colorado, there is a shelf of his books with her careful notes in the margins, and the answer she needed was printed in them, all along, in the chapters about turning around and going home. The man she worshipped earned the right to climb without oxygen over a lifetime, and I watched her skip straight there. She copied the one part of him that was never the point. It was July 18th, 2014 on K2, rising through the isolated Karakoram Mountains, along the high-altitude boundary zone between northern Pakistan and western China, an area defined by long glacial valleys, shifting ice fields, and rapidly changing summit conditions. Rachel Comia was 29 years old and worked as a physical therapist in Portland, Oregon. She and her husband had built their climbing experience through the Pacific Northwest and the Andes, developing a steady, methodical progression into technical terrain. K2 represented a significant step beyond that range, where conditions above 26,000 feet leave little margin for error. Months before the expedition, her objective evolved into a personal documentary-style summit attempt, centered on carrying part of her wedding dress for summit photography, treating it as a symbolic anchor rather than standard gear. After early sponsorship support collapsed, the project became more self-directed and informally structured, with added emotional weight placed on completing the visual concept. Bringing something like that up there changes how every decision feels. Even small ones start getting tied to it. She joined a commercial expedition operating along the standard Southeast Ascent corridor, where multiple teams, fixed lines, and overlapping camps created congestion under unstable Karakoram summer conditions. During acclimatization, she experienced variable weather, including snowfall and wind loading. At Camp 3, she developed persistent cough, reduced appetite, and fragmented sleep, but continued filming despite incomplete recovery between rotations. At higher camps, guides started noticing she wasn't recovering as quickly and needed more help with basic tasks. Before the summit push, she reshuffled her gear and cut back on emergency insulation, just to make space for filming equipment and the wedding dress, which stayed easy to reach the whole way up. The summit push began overnight in deteriorating conditions. Congestion along fixed ropes led to prolonged static exposure in extreme cold, while several climbers turned back. Rachel continued upward with a smaller group after falling behind the main flow during repeated pauses to manage gear and reposition the dress within her pack system. Throughout the ascent, the dress became a recurring point of interruption. Brief stops to adjust its placement beneath outer layers or prevent snagging on harness components created small but repeated delays between rope transitions. These pauses accumulated into increased spacing from her rope partners, though no single moment was considered critical in isolation. She eventually reached the summit later in the rotation, under conditions already outside the initial weather window. Descent began immediately afterward, in worsening visibility and increasing wind. As she moved down from the summit, additional pauses occurred to resecure and reposition the dress after it shifted under layered clothing during exertion. These brief stops, combined with fatigue and cold, gradually increased separation from her husband and the other climbers ahead of her during fixed-line transitions, where spacing was already fragile. Near the upper descent corridor, reduced visibility and fresh snowfall obscured markers and rope anchors. During one of these intervals, a hesitation to fully resecure her gear before continuing resulted in a further delay at a junction between established and secondary descent lines. That small spacing gap caused her to drift off the main tracked corridor into a less defined route below overlapping footprints. In whiteout conditions, everything starts to look like it might be the right way, even when it isn't. As conditions got worse, she kept following what looked like the main line without realizing she had drifted off it. The ground slowly changed into a soft, snow-covered slope above a hidden field of crevasses. with a buried snow bridge stretching over a void underneath the fresh snow. When she stepped onto the concealed bridge, the structure collapsed under load, sending her into a deep, crevasse system below the descent path. Investigators later concluded that the snow bridge showed no visible surface indicators at the time of travel due to recent snowfall and wind redistribution. Search operations began once weather conditions improved, but access delays and unstable snowpack slowed ground response. Her body was later recovered approximately 80 feet below the entry point during a brief recovery window supported by aerial reconnaissance. The expedition review identified contributing factors, including fatigue during descent, deteriorating weather, separation from the main rope group during repeated gear management pauses, and navigation drift in near whiteout conditions. The final assessment emphasized that the critical failure point was not a single technical error, but a hesitation-driven delay pattern linked to repeated interruptions while managing personal gear, which ultimately led to loss of spacing, route deviation, and entry onto unstable terrain. It was September 18, 2017, and Manaslu Base Camp sat at roughly 1,500 feet on a rocky moraine above the Budi Gandaki River Valley. The autumn season had pulled in dozens of commercial teams to the mountain's northeast face, part of the growing commercial traffic Manaslu had been seeing for years, and a sign of just how popular the peak had gotten as one of the more commercially accessible 8,000ers in the Himalayas. Tents were spread out across uneven glacial debris, and you could pretty much tell which teams had money and which ones were on a budget, just by looking at the setups. Prayer flags rippled in a persistent wind, carrying the smell of glacier ice and kerosene stoves. The temperature at dawn hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze condensation inside tent walls, but warm enough that sheltered spots turned comfortable by mid-morning. Among the climbers preparing for the season's first summit window was Russell Kemp, a 51-year-old from Dallas, Texas, who had arrived 12 days earlier with equipment that cost more than some expeditions' entire budgets, and a confidence that had been building for years. Russell made his money in commercial real estate and energy consulting, the kind of industries where sounding certain about things was basically the same as being good at them. 3 years earlier, he had discovered mountaineering offered the same currency. A guided ascent of Kilimanjaro had been followed by Elbrus, Aconcagua, and Amadablam in Nepal the previous autumn. Each summit added to a growing narrative. The businessman who conquered fear and altitude with the same discipline he brought to closing deals. The narrative had pretty much become a business on its own at that point. Russell had secured a book deal, a leadership manual built around his mountaineering experiences with each chapter tied to a summit. The advance had been spent months ago on a speaking agent and promotional materials that already described him as an 8,000-meter summiteer. Several corporate engagements were booked for the following spring. Manaslu was supposed to deliver the credential that held the entire structure together. Walking away wasn't really an option when that much money was already out the door. I can't even be mad at Russell the way I'm usually mad at the people in these stories, because he genuinely wasn't being reckless. He was being cornered by his own promises and his own spending, and I think most people, honestly, would have struggled to walk away from that much money on the line, even if the mountain was screaming at them to turn around. Russell's expedition was organized by a smaller Kathmandu-based company, operating on thin margins. He had talked them down on price pretty aggressively, getting a rate way below what most people paid by agreeing to 2 Sherpas, instead of the higher support arrangement Bikram had originally recommended, which for someone with his experience level was already cutting it close. Bikram had pushed for additional summit day support, but Russell declined the added expense. The company's founder, Bikram Rai, had agreed under the condition that Russell follow all safety protocols. Russell signed the waiver without reading it and posted a photo of himself at base camp the same evening, captioned with something about beginning the hardest chapter yet. The 2 Sherpas assigned to Russell were Chiwang Lendu and Pemba Rinji. Chiwang was 45 and had been guiding on 8,000-meter peaks for 22 years. He had summited Manaslu 6 times, Everest 4 times, and Cho Oyu 3 times. Other Sherpas trusted Chiwang's judgment because he could usually tell when a climber was deteriorating before the climber themselves would admit it, like he could genuinely just pick up on stuff that other guides missed. Chiwang watched how climbers moved when they thought no one was paying attention, how they ate, how their hands worked during basic tasks. Over 2 decades, he had built up a catalog of patterns that predicted outcomes with uncomfortable accuracy. Chiwang is the person in this story I think about the most, and it's not even close. Pemba Rinji was 28, lean and quiet, with 4 8,000-meter summits. He had worked with Chiwang for 3 seasons and treated the older man's judgments as education rather than opinion. Pemba came from the Rolwaling Valley, sent most of what he earned back home, and was saving up to get qualified as a trekking operator, which would eventually get him off the high peaks and into the business side of things. Acclimatization rotations began on September the 20th. Weather delays and rest days stretched the rotations across the following week and a half. The first took climbers to Camp 1 at roughly 18,000 feet. Russell kept pace on the approach, but Chiwang noticed details that would not appear in any dispatch. His rest stops ran a bit longer than they should have, and his breathing carried this rasp during moderate effort that suggested his lungs were working way harder than his pace justified. These were preliminary observations, though. Altitude affected everyone differently, and Chiwang filed them without comment. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at approximately 20,500 feet, positioned on a broad snow plateau beneath massive seracs. The sun bouncing off the surrounding ice turned the whole plateau into basically an oven during midday, the reflected heat making it feel far warmer than the actual air temperature, and forcing everyone to strip layers and just drink water constantly. Russell arrived well behind the other clients, and by the following morning was experiencing persistent headache and nausea he blamed on bad food. What Chiwang found near Russell's tent that afternoon changed his assessment entirely. While clearing snow from the guy lines, he noticed a torn blister pack partially buried in wind-blown snow near the vestibule. Several doses were already missing. The packaging was dexamethasone, a corticosteroid used to treat cerebral edema at altitude. Dex was the kind of thing you carried in the medical kit for emergencies, not something you were supposed to be popping during acclimatization like it was aspirin. The drug could temporarily suppress cerebral edema symptoms like headache, confusion, and loss of coordination, but it did nothing to address the underlying failure to acclimatize, and it did nothing at all for the pulmonary side, the fluid building in the lungs that had its own separate progression and could keep worsening even while a climber temporarily appeared functional. Taking Dex to manage symptoms wasn't inherently dangerous. The drug genuinely saved lives when paired with descent. The problem was Russell wasn't using it to buy time to get down, he was using it to keep going up, masking the signals that should have been telling him to turn around. Without descent, the drug just delayed the reckoning to a higher altitude where the options for help got worse by the hour. The Dex is where I kinda just check out on Russell because this wasn't some accident. He was actively choosing to fake being healthy over actually being healthy, and hoping the mountain wouldn't notice. Chiwang showed the packaging to Pemba that evening. The exchange, later recalled by Pemba when other climbers discussed the incident, was brief. Chiwang had seen this exact pattern twice before. Clients who were basically drugging themselves to hide how badly they were adapting, and both of those situations had needed emergency evacuations. One of them didn't make it. What made it dangerous was what made it invisible. A client on Dex looked functional, answered questions fine, kept pace on moderate terrain. The only signs lived in details. Chiwang had spent decades learning to read. The slightly widened stance, hands that fumbled when no one seemed to be watching, the cough that kept going at a pitch suggesting fluid where fluid should not be. The following morning, Chiwang radioed Bikram Rai at base camp with his findings and recommended Russell descend for medical evaluation. Bikram spoke with Russell privately. Russell flat out denied taking anything other than basic painkillers, totally brushed off what Chiwang was saying, and when Bikram kept pushing, made it clear he would take his complaints public. Bikram, who wasn't physically present to enforce a descent, stopped short of issuing an order he couldn't back up from base camp. The third rotation reached Camp 3 at roughly 22,900 feet on fixed ropes below the Sirex band. Russell arrived last and entered his tent without eating. Chi-Wang noticed his breathing had picked up a persistent quality that went beyond normal exertion at that elevation, not dramatic enough to alarm the Western guides, but enough to concern someone who had been listening to clients breathe at altitude for 2 decades. A German climber from another expedition later mentioned watching Russell take noticeably longer than expected on routine tasks around camp, the kind of slowness that could be exhaustion or could be something worse depending on what you knew to look for. That evening, Chi-Wang radioed Bikram again, recommending against including Russell in the summit push. Bikram told Chi-Wang to monitor him closely while he assessed whether Russell could still safely continue. After the call, Pemba recalled, Chi-Wang sat outside the tent, watching the upper mountain in fading light. He told Pemba that Russell was already above where his body could sustain itself, and everything from here was pretending. The mountain would collect what it was owed. The only question was where. That line honestly haunts me because Chi-Wang had seen this play out before, and he knew exactly how it was going to end, and the one person who needed to listen had already shut him down. Like, what do you even do with that? Teams descended to base camp for rest. Russell posted photos from Camp 3 saying his acclimatization was going strong and the summit attempt was coming up, and the comments just filled up with people cheering him on who had absolutely no idea how much medication was holding his acclimatization together. The summit window opened on September 28th, a 48-hour break in the wind pattern with clear skies. Climbers staged through the camps starting September 26th to reach Camp 4 at roughly 25,000 feet by the evening of September 27th. Russell had started supplemental oxygen upon arriving at Camp 4, earlier than several stronger climbers on the route. Russell moved through the lower camps at a pace Chi-Wang later described as borrowed, like it was functional enough that nobody could officially pull the plug on him, but clearly being sustained by something other than his actual physiology. The wet cough persisted. His sleep at Camp 2 was broken by coughing fits, audible through neighboring tent walls. At Camp 2, Chi-Wang made one final attempt. He approached Russell directly and told him plainly that his body was not prepared for the summit push. He described what he had observed and offered to accompany Russell on a descent without judgment or consequences. Russell's response, which Pemba and a Sherpa from another team both saw happen, was instant. He basically told Chi-Wang he hadn't spent what he spent just to get turned around by someone whose job was carrying bags. I had to read that part of Pemba's account twice because, the man has more summits than Russell has base camps, and he just got called a bag carrier to his face for trying to save him. That comment kinda just reduced 22 years of expertise down to a service role, and made it pretty obvious that Russell saw the whole thing as something he paid for, not a partnership. Chi-Wang absorbed it without visible reaction, nodded, and returned to his preparations. That evening, Chi-Wang told Pemba to keep his own oxygen reserves high during the summit push. When Russell collapsed, not if but when, they would need everything they carried for the rescue attempt. He wanted Pemba to have enough to get himself down alive, regardless of what happened to the client. They departed Camp 4 shortly after midnight on September 28th, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusting to 25 miles per hour, cold but manageable. The route climbed steeply through mixed snow and rock on fixed ropes. Headlamps from other teams dotted the darkness, a slow procession ascending towards the exposed summit ridge. Russell climbed with the fixed determination of someone operating on something other than physical reserves. His pace was slow, but he never actually stopped, each step planted with this deliberate heaviness that you could read as either discipline or desperation, depending on what you knew about him. Chi-Wang, directly behind on the fixed rope, monitored his breathing like someone watching a timer he could not stop. Russell had already burned through one bottle faster than planned, running a high flow rate, his body demanding support that confirmed what Chi-Wang already knew. Nobody tells you that the worst part of covering these stories isn't the deaths. For me, it's always the slow buildup where everyone watching already knows how it ends and you just have to sit there while the guy keeps climbing higher. By dawn, Russell had reached approximately 25,500 feet after over 5 hours of climbing, well behind the pace needed for a safe summit and return. Other clients had passed him. He kept stopping more and more often, leaning on his ice axe during breaks that got longer every single time, and at one point he briefly pulled his mask aside and just doubled over, coughing. This wet, deep sound audible to climbers, stopped nearby on the fixed line, the kind of noise that basically tells you the lungs are losing. Chiwang checked his oxygen during this rest. At his current flow rate, Russell was burning through bottles faster than the rotation plan allowed, and Chiwang realized they would reach the descent with far less reserve than intended. Chiwang told him directly. Russell demanded they continue. The final summit ridge led toward Manaslu's 26,781-foot summit, less technically demanding than many 8,000ers, but absolutely unforgiving to any climber who lingers. Russell Kemp reached the summit at 11:40 a.m., more than 11 hours after departing Camp 4, nearly 3 hours behind the turnaround pace most commercial teams considered safe, having consumed oxygen and physical reserves at a rate that left almost nothing for the return. Chiwang took 3 photographs with Russell's camera. In those images, which later got passed around in the coverage of what happened next, Russell's posture pretty much tells the whole story that his mask was hiding. Shoulders dropped, stance wide, just to keep his balance. Ice axe planted at an angle that made it look more like a crutch than something he was holding for the photo. He looked like a man standing somewhere his body had been telling him for weeks he had no business being. He made it though, and that's the part that kinda wrecks me. He actually got the summit photo and the credential and everything he wanted, and none of it mattered because coming back down was always going to be the part his body wasn't gonna let him do. Chiwang insisted on immediate descent after 8 minutes. Russell did not resist. They began descending at 11:48 a.m. into deteriorating conditions. Clouds building earlier than forecast, visibility thinning, temperature falling. For the first hour, Russell descended slowly, but he was at least functional. His crampon placements needed constant corrections. Front points, scraping off rock before catching on ice, and his pace was maybe half what a healthy climber would manage, but he was at least upright and responding to directions. Clouds continued building below, filling valleys with white and making the mountain feel increasingly cut off from help. Chiwang stayed directly behind. Pemba followed with the remaining oxygen and emergency gear. At approximately 1:15 p.m., near 25,800 feet, Russell stopped on the fixed line and did not resume. Chiwang closed the gap and found him just standing there with both hands locked on the rope, head down, breathing fast and shallow. And when Chiwang put a hand on his shoulder, Russell didn't react at all. His eyes, barely visible through fogged-up goggles, had this unfocused emptiness that Chiwang had been expecting to see since Camp 2, basically the look of a brain that's losing its grip on the signals keeping a body moving. Whatever benefit the dexamethasone had been providing was no longer enough to compensate for the altitude and exhaustion. Whether he had run out of pills or the illness had simply progressed beyond what the drug could suppress, the result was the same. Weeks of suppressed symptoms rapidly accelerated above 25,000 feet, the cerebral and pulmonary deterioration compounding together at the worst possible point on the mountain, exposed with failing weather and dwindling oxygen. Over the next 30 minutes, Russell's condition came apart in stages. First, his responses to Chiwang's questions started arriving late, words slurred and disconnected. Then his crampon placements became erratic, kicking at the ice without purpose. His speech broke apart into sounds that didn't connect to anything. His legs gave out twice and dropped him to his knees on the steep slope where only his safety tether, clipped to the fixed line, kept him from sliding. And at one point, he actually tried to unclip himself from the rope entirely, which would have sent him thousands of feet down the face. Chiwang grabbed his hand and stopped him. By 2 p.m., Russell could no longer stand. He collapsed at approximately 25,400 feet and did not rise. His breathing was heavy and wet, basically the sound of lungs filling up with fluid that his body couldn't clear anymore. His eyes remained open, but had retreated to wherever consciousness goes when the brain can no longer sustain it. Chiwang knelt beside him and checked his pulse, present but weak, the heartbeat of a body shutting down. Chiwang called it at Camp 2, called it at Camp 3, told Bikram, told Russell directly, and now we are at 25,400 feet, with it happening exactly the way he said it would, and I just keep wondering what that feels like. being that right about something you'd give anything to be wrong about. What followed was the effort that ended Chiwang Lendu's career. Even knowing Russell was almost certainly past saving at this altitude, Chiwang started trying to lower him anyway. Not because he thought it would work, but because that's what guides do, regardless of whether the client earned it. Chiwang and Pemba rigged a lowering system using the fixed rope, slings, and Russell's harness. Wind above 30 miles per hour, temperature well below -20, thin oxygen degrading their own coordination. The work demanded taking gloves off repeatedly to handle hardware with precision, every second of bare skin against metal, adding up. They managed to lower Russell less than 100 vertical feet over nearly 2 hours, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that's roughly 190 pounds of unresponsive weight being guided past rock outcrops and anchors on steep, icy terrain. Gravity helped, but controlling that weight required constant braking. Each anchor point meant stopping, resetting everything, and feeding Russell past, a process that ate up minutes they didn't have. Chiwang controlled speed from above. Pemba guided the body from below, bracing against the slope to keep Russell from swinging into rock. During one lowering sequence, a carabiner jammed under load. Chiwang spent nearly 10 minutes working the mechanism with bare hands at approximately 25,000 feet. The air temperature against his exposed skin was compounding damage that had already been developing from repeated exposure throughout the rescue, but the only other option was abandoning the whole system, and everyone clipped into it. So he kept going. By the time he freed the carabiner, the cumulative exposure had pushed both hands into severe frostbite territory, skin waxy and bloodless, sensation fading from his fingertips toward his knuckles. He continued working. For another 45 minutes, Chiwang operated the lowering system with hands that were progressively losing the ability to grip. Pemba, watching from below, could see the deterioration before Chiwang was willing to admit it. After hours of repeated exposure throughout the rescue, his movements were getting sloppy, his fingers not closing right around the rope anymore, and a single mistake at the anchor would have killed all three of them. Pemba radioed Camp 4 at 4:35 p.m. No additional support could arrive before dark. He was told to get Chiwang down and leave the client. Chiwang refused. He tried to keep going with hands that couldn't even feel the rope anymore, fingers curling around it out of pure muscle memory. Pemba stepped in and physically pulled him off the anchor, which meant overruling the man he'd spent 3 years looking up to as a mentor, and neither of them ever talked about what happened between them in that moment publicly. They clipped Russell to an anchor beside the fixed line with a short tether, covered him with an emergency blanket weighted with snow, and started the descent in fading light with the wind picking up behind them. Pemba had to physically pull his own mentor off that anchor for a guy who called them bag carriers 2 days before. And honestly, I've got nothing profound to say about it. It just makes me angry every time. They reached Camp 4 at 7:20 p.m. Chiwang's hands were wrapped in mittens, but the damage was already done. Russell Kemp didn't make it through the night. A team sent up from Camp 4 at first light found him at around 25,000 feet, still clipped to the anchor, right where Chiwang and Pemba had left him. The emergency blanket had been ripped half off by the overnight wind. His body was later moved to a lower camp during a subsequent weather window, but conditions prevented further transport, and he was secured off the main route near a crevasse area after further recovery efforts became impossible. The cause of death was listed as high-altitude cerebral edema, compounded by pulmonary edema, hypothermia, and exhaustion. He was 51 years old. The speaking engagements were canceled. The book was never written. Chiwang Lendu was evacuated to Kathmandu 2 days later. Surgeons ended up taking 2 fingers off his right hand and 2 off his left. The damage had just been going on way too long for anyone to do anything about it. The hands that spent 22 years drilling ice screws and rigging anchors and holding ropes under loads that would have wrecked most people genuinely couldn't even close around a carabiner anymore. 22 years of high-altitude guiding, 6 Manaslu summits, 4 on Everest, all of it ended not because of a decision he made, but because of a client who wouldn't let him make the right one. Chiwang went back to the Gorkha district and took a logistics job with a trekking company in Kathmandu. People who knew him said adjusting was hard in ways that went way beyond the physical stuff. Pembaringi completed 2 more seasons on the high peaks before transitioning into the trekking business he had been saving for. He later told an interviewer that the hardest part of the mountains was genuinely never the climbing. It was watching someone choose something the mountain was never gonna allow and being expected to somehow stop it from happening. It was July 27th, 2018 on K2, deep within the Karakoram Range, along the rugged borderlands between Pakistan and China, where the upper slopes transition into the death zone and weather patterns collapse into sudden wind and whiteout cycles. Lauren Hayes was 34 years old and based in Scottsdale, Arizona, working as a fitness instructor and online wellness coach. Her public identity centered on endurance performance and measurable physical discipline, reinforced through documented ascents of Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Island Peak. Each climb expanded her audience and increased expectations for the next objective, with K2 positioned as the defining summit. Months before the expedition, she entered sponsorship agreements tied directly to summit-based content delivery. The climb was partially financed through media obligations, requiring imagery from the upper mountain, effectively linking summit timing to contractual output. For this purpose, she carried a lightweight, athletic-style dress intended for summit photography, introduced publicly as part of the expedition narrative. That expectation followed her into every logistical and pacing decision on the mountain. When something is tied to the goal like that, it doesn't feel optional anymore. Her prior experience remained limited to guided, non-technical, and moderate, high-altitude climbs, leaving a significant gap compared to sustained, technical exposure above 26,000 feet on K2. The expedition moved through the early rotations without anything major going wrong, but things started getting tougher above Camp 2. Lauren began dealing with constant headaches, nausea, and a kind of ongoing fatigue that just didn't really go away between climbs. It was picked up during routine checks, but she kept filming anyway, often pulling off her gloves and face protection in freezing wind just to work the camera, which meant more time exposed while already running on limited oxygen. At Camp 4 near 26,000 feet, she reported poor sleep and limited recovery prior to the summit push. A minor equipment correction involving crampon security was addressed the night before departure, but not escalated. The summit rotation began overnight under heavy traffic as multiple teams converged on a narrow weather window, creating congestion along the bottleneck and traverse with prolonged static exposure in extreme cold. As delays accumulated, oxygen consumption rose beyond planned limits. At this altitude, oxygen functions as a critical physiological support, and depletion directly affects cognition and motor control. Her pace became irregular, with slower transitions and intermittent hesitation at anchor points that normally require near automatic execution. Despite these signs, she continued beyond the safe turnaround window driven by the summit schedule embedded in the expedition's contractual expectations. During descent, worsening wind and limited visibility reduced contrast across the fixed rope system. Snow accumulation obscured anchors and softened terrain definition between sections. Climbing partners later reported prolonged pauses at transitions, where she appeared disoriented and required repeated attempts to re-establish connections between anchors. Investigators later identified probable high-altitude cerebral edema combined with oxygen depletion as key drivers of cognitive breakdown. Decision-making deteriorated under sustained hypoxia, shifting from procedural climbing behavior to impaired sequencing of simple actions. Near a steep section above Camp 4, she mismanaged a transition between fixed anchors and drifted off the established rope line during a brief sequencing error. From that point, instead of a single fall event, she moved into progressively worsening disorientation in near whiteout conditions. Separated from the main fixed corridor, she continued into terrain with no clear route markers, where overlapping tracks and fresh snowfall eliminated reliable navigation cues. In this environment, small errors in direction compounded rapidly, leading to full loss of route awareness. Whiteout doesn't feel dramatic while you're in it. It just turns everything the same color, and you're guessing if the ground is still there underneath you. As conditions deteriorated further, she was unable to reorient to the fixed line system. Exposure to wind, altitude, and oxygen deprivation led to complete functional collapse in place, rather than a recoverable descent error. Search efforts later confirmed she remained in upper terrain outside the main corridor until conditions allowed recovery access. Her body was found after a weather window opened up, and what they saw pointed to long exposure in extreme cold and altitude-related brain effects that likely led to confusion, loss of coordinations, and getting off the intended route. The expedition review identified severe fatigue, oxygen depletion, and probable high-altitude cerebral edema as primary contributors. It also noted that contractual summit timing pressures, combined with extended filming obligations and oxygen-dependent pacing constraints, contributed to the decision threshold being exceeded, shifting the incident from a controlled descent to a progressive cognitive failure in extreme conditions, rather than a single isolated accident event.